Okay. From Mary Jo Kraneker and Richard Riley, who commits fraud and why? The profile and psychology of the fraudster. Okay. Let you know they put the thing right where my camera is. All right. Let's tell you what, I'm going to turn off the camera. You don't need to look at me anyhow. And besides, I can then lower the thing and be able to see my screen. Okay, let's try that. So April 20, 2022, Department of Justice announced criminal charges against 2 people in California related to a scheme that allegedly made $144 million in false and fraudulent health claims to federal programs for unnecessary COVID-19 tests. According to the FBI, back in 2012, Patricia Smith, 57 at the time, and former controller at Beryl Acura, pled guilty in federal court to charges of embezzlement, and she, this is a different case, okay, fraudulently transferred $10.3 million from Acura's accounts. And those are just 2 cases, and there's so many more, and I can tell you about a few of them. Again, if there's time, I shall. All right. So here are the modules of this chapter. Module 1, we talk about the idea of criminology. It's probably the only accounting course you're going to take, hopefully the only course that you're going to take that talks about criminology, the study of crime and criminals and its interface with fraud, financial crimes, and forensic accounting issues. The next module develops a profile of the garden variety fraudster using one of the most recognized tools. Yes, the fraud triangle. If you folks remember, there was a television show some years ago called The West Wing. It was even talked about on an episode of The West Wing. Module 3 looks at some of the early efforts to fine-tune and improve the fraud triangle, adding the roles of personal integrity, capability, gender, and the influence of the organization. As you'll see, it's become sort of a, not sure, I was going to say a geometry lesson, but also kind of origami, the way they keep playing with the triangle. Module 4 reviews more recent findings from research that considers fraudsters whose profile is inconsistent with the fraud triangle. And then Module 5 offers a cautionary tale for practicing forensic accountants and fraud examiners related to courtroom testimony grounded in the fraud triangle. That is to say, courts have said, this really has not been tested enough to be, eligible for use in a courtroom. Okay, so here's number 1. And those are the topics that we're going to cover. All right, so let's look at that first one. Criminology is the sociological study of crime and criminals. Why do people obey the law? Okay, well, very often it's for fear of punishment or desire for rewards. And then there's those who obey the law because, to act in a just and moral manner according to society's standards is a good thing. Most civilized societies are dependent upon people doing the right thing. Okay, fortunately it's not a constant surveillance society, although it's getting more and more. But we expect folks to behave themselves, and in most cases they do. And I say most cases people choose to follow the law because it's the right thing to do, especially if the law is the right thing to do. Further, people usually follow laws with which they agree. Okay. Now then, we have this term we use, occupational fraud and abuse. I think we've mentioned this before, defined as the use of one's occupation for personal enrichment through the deliberate misuse or misapplication of the employing organization's resources or assets. Okay. Such as asset misappropriation, corruption, pilferage, that's a great term, isn't it? Pilferage, petty theft, and fictitious payroll schemes. Four common elements of occupational fraud and abuse is one, it's clandestine. Okay, it's not like a bank robbery where you go in and you and your conspirators pull out guns and announce that this is a bank robbery. No, it's done by one of the people at the bank. What we're talking about is, say, misappropriation. Someone at the bank using their position to misappropriate money, maybe even more than those bank robbers got, but they do it quietly, clandestinely, secretly. But in doing so, they're violating the employee's fiduciary duties to the organization. Again, committed for the purpose of either direct or indirect financial benefit to the employee. It costs the employee organizations, again, that should be assets. I got to tell these guys to fix revenues or reserves. We use the term employee as any person who receives regular and periodic compensation from an organization for his or her labor. Okay. White collar crime is crime in the upper white collar classes. Okay. You don't hear that term as much as in the past, I believe, but someone who works in an office is a white collar worker, as opposed to someone who works, say, on a line in a factory would be a blue collar worker. We still use that differentiation. For a while, it's still used to some extent. Pink collar worker, and that would be a woman who's a worker. All right. Again, often used interchangeably with occupational fraud and economic crime, typically associated with an abuse of power, because here's someone in the executive or managerial ranks abusing their power to commit fraud. Organizational crime. Now, no, it's not organized crime, it's organizational crime. So organizational crime occurs when entities, companies, corporations, not-for-profits, which is really the same as nonprofits, and government bodies, otherwise legitimate and law-abiding organizations, are involved in criminal offense. It can be such things as unfair pricing, unfair business practices, and tax evasion. Under, especially federal law, organizations can be prosecuted in a similar manner to individuals. Now, you can't put a corporation in prison, but you can fine them a lot. You can essentially prevent them from doing business. Okay, one of the things that occurs when a contractor for the Department of Defense is caught doing something, they are forbidden from working, taking contracts in the Department of Defense again. And if that's where 90% of your contracts come from, yeah, that pretty much puts you out of business. Organizational crime is more of a problem internationally, often consists of unfair pricing, unfair business practices, and violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and tax evasion. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is that act which makes it illegal to essentially bribe a foreign official. Okay. And it also requires companies to have appropriate controls in place so that when you have operations in foreign countries, that you know what's going on over there. It's more common for corporations to become embroiled in legal battles that wind up in civil court. So organizational crime often ends up in court. All right, as opposed to organized crime, are often complex, involving many individuals, organizations, and shell companies, often cross jurisdictional borders. A couple of examples of fraud, organized crime. Money laundering addresses the means by which organized criminals take money from illegal sources and process it so that it appears as if it came from legitimate business sources. Okay, one of the big ones would be illegal narcotics, because, hey, despite all the online transactions going on, illegal narcotics at the retail level is still a cash business. Okay, if you wanted to buy some whatever heroin, crystal meth, you generally don't use a credit card. All right, they don't accept credit cards. They want cash. So you end up with a whole bunch of cash. Well, okay, what are you going to do with that? You can take it down to the bank and try putting it in the bank. And as we'll see, there are regulations where the bank will report it if somebody's depositing a big chunk of cash into the bank. So you do something else. And in the past, there was some pizza parlor in downstate Illinois that was used to launder cash for organized crime. Because if a pizza parlor or some other business that uses a lot of cash comes into the bank and drops off a big deposit, you wouldn't think anything bad of it, So okay, they had a lot of customers who paid with cash, but that's becoming fewer and fewer, with having truly cash businesses, as more and more adapt to the use of plastic, right? Movie theaters, what used to be where organized crime would buy or take over a movie theater and use that to launder money. But we'll see there's all sorts of techniques for that. Mail and wire fraud involves schemes that use the postal service or interstate wires to execute the fraud. And just to be clear on that, in the past, mail fraud, you had to, at some point in your scheme, use the postal service. That's been expanded to include FedEx, DHL, UPS, etc. So you can't get around mail fraud simply by using FedEx, okay? And the other is interstate wires. So it actually started out originally with telegraph, and then telephone, okay? And internet now does come under wire fraud. There was one case that even said, it was a case where the individual was using a telephone to commit a fraud, but pointed out that the telephone was simply using it like an intercom to call somebody in another office, okay, down the hall. So it wasn't an interstate call at all. And what the government argued and won was that, yes, but that telephone could have been used to make a long distance phone call out of state. The fact that it was being used simply to call someone down the hall does not make it exempt from interstate wire fraud. Kind of a stretch, I think, but just putting it out there. And then criminal conspiracy occurs when two or more people intend to commit an illegal act and take some steps towards its implementation. Notice the illegal act does not have to be performed, right? But they wanted to do it. Okay, so they put in place all the plans that they need and did some overt act. Overt as opposed to covert, which is secret. An overt act. They bought the computer software they needed to do some sort of a hacking. They bought latex gloves and masks or whatever, but they were caught before the illegal act took place. But they were planning on it, and it wasn't just guys sitting around a room and saying, "Hey, if you were going to rip off the company, how would you do it?" And just spitballing ideas. No, you have to take it further. There has to have been some step towards performing it. Then we have my old favorite, the racketeer. I've told Dick Riley it's racketeer influenced with a D at the end, and Corrupt Organizations Act. Okay, and the idea is, if we take it apart, you've got two things. You have, looking at the back end, A corrupt organization. A corrupt organization is, if it falls into the definitions in the RICO Act, a corrupt organization is illegal. Likewise, a organization that is influenced by racketeers, okay, sort of the classic organized crime. If you look at the show The Sopranos or any going back some decades, garbage hauling in the state of New Jersey for a long time was essentially controlled by organized crime. Well, that would be an example of a racketeer-influenced organization. As opposed to, say, Bernie Madoff's organization wasn't connected to mobsters, but it was a corrupt organization. And there was a Supreme Court case that made it clear that because one of the arguments in defending RICO prosecutions in the past was, look, there were no mobsters involved here, there were no racketeers involved, and the court said no. It can be either a racketeer influence organization or a corrupt organization. So if it's a corrupt organization, you don't have to have mobsters involved. Okay. So what did it do? It outlaws investing illegal funds in another business. So you've got money from narcotics or illegal gambling or what have you. You take that money and you buy, as I say, maybe a movie theater or a pizza parlor to try and launder money. You used illegal funds to get that business. It outlaws the acquisition of a business through illegal acts, such as extortion. You sell me your business, or I'll break your kneecaps, what have you. And outlaws the conduct of business affairs with funds derived from illegal acts. So you can't take that money from selling narcotics and use it in your business. Okay. A couple other legal terms you may remember from your business law classes. Torts, breach of duty, and civil litigation. So under Black's Law Dictionary, which is like the big law dictionary, tort is a private or civil wrong or injury other than breach of contract for which the law will provide a remedy in the form of an action for damages. Okay, so what are we talking about? Well, we're not talking about breaching of contract. So if you have a contract with someone, to buy their house and then they breach it, that's not a tort. That's a breach of contract. On the other hand, just think of those television commercials for lawyers. You've been injured, get a check, right? You might be eligible for compensation. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about suing people for damages. They did something to damage you. Might have been an auto accident, might have been bad food, what have you, and you're suing them. Not for a breach of contract, but for some other private or civil wrong or injury. Okay. Now, there's also a tort, kind of in the contract field, the tort of contract interference. So if two people have a contract to do something, and then you get involved to try and do something, prevent that person. Say you, let's change this around. You have a contract. You signed a contract, or you had made a contract years ago with this up and coming singer named Taylor Swift to have her come and sing at your birthday party in 2026. You got the contract back in 2006. All right. Well, maybe some big stadium wants her to perform, and they interfere, and they tell Taylor, tell you what, Taylor, we'll pay you a lot more money if you come to us and breach that other contract. Then you can sue that stadium for interfering with the contract that you have. Okay. Where we see a lot of tort is in the area of negligence. where somebody, you're walking down the street and somebody is driving recklessly, their car comes up on the sidewalk and hits you. Okay, well, it's negligence. And negligence, the elements of that you need right there. One, duty. Someone who drives a car has a duty to operate it safely. There was a breach of that duty. Yeah, hopping up on the sidewalk and running someone over is a breach of that duty. That your injuries were in fact caused by their action. And there's also something called proximate cause. And some of that has to go with, was it foreseeable that this could have occurred? And then there has to have been damages. Okay, you had to be injured in some way. So the injured party must prove 2 points to win awards for damages. One, that the person you're suing is liable or legally liable, and then that there were damages, and then the jury gets to decide how much. All right. So who commits fraud and why? And let's talk about the fraud triangle. But before we do that, I just saw somebody checking in, and let me make sure I got everyone's name here. Okay, one moment. Okay, whoops, gotta click the pen. All right, very good. So then, fraudsters, by their very nature, are trust violators. That's what we call them, fraudsters. Okay, they commit frauds. Perpetrators generally have achieved a position of trust within an organization and have chosen to violate that trust. Okay, so again, the idea of fraud or organizational occupational fraud, it's someone within the organization using their position to commit the fraud. So it's not just walking into your place of employment and walking out with something. It's that would not be so clandestine. But so you're employed by a car dealership. You go in, you get behind the wheel of the car on display, and you drive it through the front window and steal it. No, that's not clandestine. On the other hand, you phony up the paperwork to make it look like somebody bought that car, and you have it delivered to a spot where you take possession of it. That would be fraud. Okay, for the fraudsters, profiles tend to look like those of average persons. And this is the thing that's this craziest thing about the area of fraud. Perpetrators of fraud, those who at least who get caught and prosecuted, tend not to have any criminal history, no criminal background. They're first timers, okay? Whereas, say, violent criminals tend to have, as they in the TV shows, a long rap sheet. All right. In more than 90% of the fraud cases examined by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, the perpetrator had been with the victim organization for more than a year. Okay. Fraud is not a crime of passion. It is generally, thought out, calculated. So, typical fraudster is a male, well-educated, middle-aged or retired, especially the ones that defraud the big dollar amounts, okay? Can be an accountant, upper management, or executive, has been with the company for 5 years or more, is acting alone, and was never charged or convicted of a criminal offense. So here are the folks who've done some great research in occupational fraud and abuse through the years. Edwin Sutherland. My favorite, Donald Cressy. It's pronounced Cressy, just like my name is pronounced. The biggest award that the ACFE gives out is called the Cressy Award. And I'll go to their annual conventions and they, I say, oh, I'm Bill Cressy. And like, oh, are you the one that the award's named after? I'm like, no. Sometimes they say, yeah. I mean, heck, it's a fraud convention. They really expect the truth. Steve Albrecht over at Brigham Young University. and his son also teaches there, Conan Albrecht. And then the team of Hollinger and Clark, some of our top fraud researchers. So here you got Edwin Sutherland. He is to white collar crime what Freud is to psychology. Okay, really the father of fraud examination, if you will, or at least the study of fraud. He was the one who came up with the term white collar crime. He also developed the theory of differential association. The idea that the basic tenet is that crime is a learned behavior. Okay. And now look at, when he was born, 1883. All right. So he was coming out of college and starting his research in the, very early 20th century, when a lot of folks thought, and some still do, that crime is not a learned behavior, but some people are just born criminals. Okay, it's almost like a genetic thing. Then it's not. It's a learned behavior. So learning of criminal behavior occurred with other persons in a process of communication. So you learn it from others. Criminality cannot occur without the assistance of other people. And the learning of criminal activity usually occurred within intimate personal groups. I would say in the past, or that's part of Sutherland's theory, but these days you can learn a lot about criminality just by going on the internet. Okay. So here you have my favorite friend, Cressy, Dr. Cressy, and he was interested in the circumstances that led trust violators to be overcome by temptation. So you have a job, they entrust you with some assets. Why do some people defraud the company where others are good, loyal employees for many, many years? Well, he developed the fraud triangle. So Dr. Steve Albrecht over there at Brigham Young in 1991 penned an article where he took Cressy's 3 conditions and developed them into a tool that's become known as the fraud triangle. And that triangle has 3 sides: perceived pressure, perceived opportunity, and rationalization. So it's they had a reason for doing it. There was some pressure on them. So we'll talk more about those right now. Hang on a second. I gotta click on something here. Alrighty. Okay. One of the things they found was, again going to that perceived pressure idea, is that the fraudster has some non-shareable financial pressure. It's something's going on. They're not sharing, if you will. They're not telling other people about it. Maybe they're embarrassed by it. Maybe they think it might hurt their career path and such. Perhaps a violation of an ascribed obligation, such as having to pay off their bookie. Okay. Problems resulting from personal failures, business reversals, physical isolation, status gaining, or something to do with the employer-employee relationship where they hate the company, they hate their boss, so now they have this financial pressure to do something about it. So let's talk about each of those. Okay, a violation of ascribed obligation. Historically proved to be a very strong motivator for financial crime. The mere fact that a person has a trusted position carries with it the implied duty to act in a manner becoming his status. People in trusted positions refuse to admit that they lost money through some disreputable act because they think they would be admitting that they're unworthy to hold the trusted position. So they lost a lot of money gambling on the Super Bowl. But they don't want, people know that I've been gambling, or they have been going down to the casino, every other day or every weekend. That would be viewed as disreputable. And I can't allow people to think of me that way. Okay. So they've got this violation of a obligation. Personal failure. Problems resulting from personal failures are those that the trusted person feels he caused through bad judgment and therefore feels personally responsible. Because these trusted individuals fear a loss of status, the individual is afraid to admit to anyone who could alleviate the situation the fact that he has a problem, which is a consequence of his own bad judgment or own fault or own stupidity. Okay. He got involved, or she got involved with someone who scammed them. Okay. And very often, people get scammed. They're afraid to tell anyone about it because they'll look bad in that person's eyes for falling for this scam. So they don't tell anyone. They don't share it with anyone. People who might be able to help them. Instead, they try to dig themselves out of a financial hole through committing a fraud. Okay. Business reversals. So that differs from personal failures because the trust violator tends to see their problem as arising from conditions beyond their control. Okay. You have a business, and because of tariffs or a war going on in the country where you import all your stuff from, or what have you, it's beyond your control. Nonetheless, status still plays a big role in the decision, and you don't want to have to explain the problem to someone else. You don't want to look like you're a failure. So the desire to maintain the appearance of success, a very common theme in cases involving business reversal. Physical isolation. The person has no one to turn to. They don't have family. They don't have friends. They don't have access to associates who could help them. Status gaining. Now, this is a little different than these others. Those are things, people are in bad situations and they're afraid to lose their status. On the other hand, these are people who want to essentially commit the fraud in order to raise or gain status. They're living beyond their means, or they're having lavish spending. They buy a ridiculously expensive car to drive around in, and bought a house in a very fancy neighborhood because they want people to think that person's a success. They're unwilling to settle for a lower status, and it creates a motivation for the trust violation, for embezzlement or whatever. In that employer-employee relation, the employed person resents their status within the organization, but feels they have no choice but to continue working for the organization. Perhaps they're underpaid, or they feel they're underpaid. They feel they're overworked. They feel they're underappreciated. And I say feel because sometimes they're not really underpaid or overworked. But there are also a lot of cases where they are underpaid and overworked and not appreciated. So now the employee feels they've been ill-treated and they're going to get even. And we'll talk about rationalization coming up, but they rationalize like, hey, I'm simply taking the money they owed me anyhow. Okay? At least in their mind. The importance of solving the problem in secret. The employee faced with an immediate, non-shareable financial need hasn't changed much over the years. They're still placed in the position of having a way to relieve the pressure that bears down on them. Dr. Cressy found it was crucial that the employee be able to resolve the financial problem in secret. Interesting thing to note is that it is not the embezzlement itself that creates the need for secrecy. It's the circumstances that led to the embezzlement. Okay. Yeah, just by the nature of embezzlement is secret, but the motivating factor is what they truly want to keep secret. Okay, so we got our fraud triangle. One of those tips, perceived pressure. Many people inside really any organization have at least some access to cash, checks, or other assets. Okay, it's amazing what you have. It might be computer equipment, it might be company secrets. Okay, all sorts of stuff, right? If you unless they just you go in, in the day they put you in a little cubicle with access to nothing. I don't take that job, but most people do have some sort of assets that they can get at. It is a perceived pressure that causes individuals to seriously consider availing themselves of the opportunity presented by, for example, an internal control or weakness. So for whatever reason, they feel they need to take some money from the organization. But looky here. There's an internal control weakness that I can exploit. I mean, there's some folks who spend a lot of the time at work doing nothing more than trying to figure out how can I rip this place off big time and get away with it. All right. Financial statement fraud, where the folks higher up in the organization are manipulating the numbers in the financial statements. Well, that is a type of fraud that's often attributed to pressures such as meeting the Wall Street analysts' expectations for return on investment, for earnings per share, net income, what have you, deadlines, cutoffs, or anything I mentioned before. Over half the compensation most executives get in big corporations is from a incentive plan, a bonus, right? So, but you only qualify the bonus if, earnings per share increased 1 cent from last year. Well, there's ways of doing that besides working hard. It's called financial fraud. Even in civil litigation, pressure can cause one organization to violate the terms and conditions of a contract. Their company's under pressure, so we'll do something. I know we had a case working with the Air Force, a supplier of material to the Air Force, violated or under financial pressure, so they started selling shoddy material to the Air Force. And one moment, while I pour myself some more beverage to keep my throat working. This was like rolled aluminum that was being used to build airplanes by another Air Force contractor. And, I don't want to be the pilot of a jet where the aluminum making up like the wings was shoddy. Okay, so they went after them. All right. So another point on that fraud triangle is perceived opportunity. Opportunity to, relieve themselves of that pressure. So the presence of a non-shareable financial problem by itself will not lead an employee to commit fraud. But they've got that pressure. They want to do something to relieve themselves of that pressure, and they say, oh, look, I figured out a way of ripping off the company, getting the money I need to relieve that pressure and not get caught. So 3 elements must be present for a trust violation to occur. 1, The non-shareable financial problem creates the motive. 2, the employee must also perceive that he has an opportunity to commit the crime without being caught. And the third and final factor is rationalization. So I say there's an opportunity. Maybe there's a breakdown in internal controls. He finds out that, oh yeah, well, they're supposed to reconcile the bank statements every month, but no one does it. So you could slip something through. Nobody will catch it. Okay. So, 2 components of perceived opportunity to commit a trust violation. 1, general information. Knowledge that the employee's position of trust could be violated. And then some sort of technical skill, the ability to commit the violation. Usually that's the same ability that the employee needed to get the job in the first place. So it's an accounting thing. They hired you to be an accountant. Well, I know how to use that. All right. So what about fraud deterrence? And this goes, I say, deterrence is we talk about in the fraud area of detecting, preventing, and deterring. Detecting, as I say, it's too late. The fraud has occurred. You're just trying to detect how it was done, who did it, how much was taken. Preventing is all about putting in those internal controls and such that would not allow this fraud to take place. Deterring, though, is playing with people's minds, right? Because employees who perceive that they will be caught are, I would say, much less likely to engage in fraudulent conduct. Again, fraud is not a crime of passion. No guy went home and found his wife was cheating on him and said, that's it, I'm going to go back to work and commit fraud. Unless she was cheating with his boss. Okay, there's an exception. But otherwise, no, this is something that's thought out as a way to relieve that perceived financial pressure. But they want to do it without getting caught. Internal controls can have a deterrent effect, but only when the employee perceives that such a control one exists in both design and operation. That's the perception of detection. Okay. I think I mentioned the computer room at a college where people were stealing equipment, and they put a closed circuit camera on the wall in the back of the room. Suddenly, people stopped stealing things. It was never hooked up to anything. They didn't have the money nor the equipment. They just put the camera up there, and they had a cable went up into the false ceiling. But it was the perception of detection that will get caught. That's the key. And that's how you can sometimes play in the heads of the fraudster. Rationalization. And this is a very interesting area to study. Again, when various researchers go into prisons and interview occupational fraudsters, especially those who've been like executives, they will tell you, look, I shouldn't really be here. And one of the reason they say this, I had a good reason to do that crime. I'm not even sure it should be considered a crime. But I had a good reason. Okay. So the occupational fraudster, for the most part, and there are always, examples that don't fit this, but they won't go forward with the fraud, even if they have the perceived pressure, even if they have the perceived opportunity. They won't do it unless they can rationalize it. Because in the back of their heads, they really know it's wrong, but they can convince themselves that they have good reason to do it. Okay? But without that, they don't commit the fraud. So it's necessary so the perpetrator can make his illegal behavior intelligible to him and maintain his concept of himself as a trusted person. And again, even after they've been caught, put on trial, and sent to prison, they haven't convinced his head that he really did something wrong. Rationalization is not an ex post facto means of justifying a theft that has already occurred. So it wasn't like you commit the embezzlement and then later you think about it and go, yeah, well, this, I can rationalize it now. No, you didn't even commit the crime until you could rationalize it in your head. The rationalization is often abandoned after the criminal act has taken place. Okay, especially they have the rationalization and they embezzle some money. They did it to pay medical bills. Okay, great. They paid them off. But you know what? They still haven't fixed that internal control weakness. And so they do it again. Now they can't really rationalize their act except to think, yeah, it felt pretty good. Yeah, I think I'll do it again. All right. Cressy placed subjects into three categories: the independent businessman, the long-term violators, and a group called the absconders. So who are these folk? Okay. Independent businessmen. These are persons who were in business for themselves and who converted deposits which had been entrusted to them. Okay, so they were given some money. They were supposed to do something with it. Maybe take it to the bank, maybe purchase some equipment with it. But they did. Perpetrators of this category use one of two common excuses. I was just borrowing the money. Okay, they took the money, they converted it, as I say, they used it for their own purposes. But I fully intend to pay it back. I was just borrowing it. Or the funds entrusted to them were really theirs. Because, I should have gotten that bonus. I should have gotten that promotion. They gave it to the boss's dim-witted cousin instead. So they really owed me this money. Almost universally felt their illegal actions were predicated by an unusual situation. Okay. That's the independent businessman. That's the term that Cressy used. Then we have the long-term violators. And these are the ones, I say, at first they might have that rationalization, but then it keeps going. And one of the things we know about fraud can be like a snowball rolling down a hill. It starts out small, but as it rolls, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. They take a small amount of funds for the employer or employee's client over time. They prefer the idea of the borrowing rationalization. I just, I had to pay my kids' college tuition, so I just borrowed some money to do that. But then I was going to pay it back. Then they keep doing it. Other rationalizations can include they were embezzling to keep their families from shame, disgrace, or poverty. Their case was a case of necessity. Their employees were cheating them financially. Their employers were dishonest towards others. And so they deserve this. I saw how they cheat other people. Oh, yeah, well, I'm going to show them. They found after they stole the money, after they quote unquote borrowed the money, they can't put it back. It's easy to steal, but how do you go back in and say, oh, here, boss, here's that money that I stole from you last year? Okay. I was just borrowing it. I'm putting it back now. Most perpetrators wanted to clean the slate, repay their debt. But perpetrators often feared losing social position, not the possibility of punishment. That was their big fear. And then we have the absconders. These are people who just take the money and run. Demographically, usually unmarried or separated from their spouses, tend to be in the lower occupational and socioeconomic status the previous two categories. Especially if they take the money and run and don't have, say, a lot of those things that someone higher up might have that makes you traceable. They could be found. You can just sort of blend into the woodwork and you're gone. Okay. Now then, excuse me. One of the most fundamental observations of Cressy's study was that all three elements had to be present for the trust violation, for the fraud to occur. The perceived non-shareable financial problem, the perceived opportunity, the ability to rationalize. If any of the elements were missing, the fraud, the trust violation did not occur, which is actually good for, for fraud examiners, especially number two. Though we can also do something or suggest to the client ways of addressing 1 and 3. Okay. For example, perceived non-shareable financial problems. I'm a big proponent of companies having programs to help their employees, to help their people. If they have problems like, gambling addiction, drug addiction, alcoholic addiction, what have you, okay? It is better that you get these people, otherwise good people, into a program to help them out. One, it's the right thing to do. But two, we find that firms that have these sort of programs tend to have fewer or less losses from fraud because you're addressing that financial problem, okay? Or having programs that, if you're in a financial situation, you can come to us. You can talk to a counselor. You can talk to people here, and we can help you out. The perceived opportunity, that really goes to controls. So if you can put the controls in place that would prevent someone from thinking that they can get away with it, as I say, putting the camera in the back of the computer room, then the fraud does not take place. And the ability to rationalize. If a company treats their people poorly or is known for cheating others, you've given your people all the rationalization they need to rip you off. So don't treat your people poorly. Have them, like working for the company so much that they couldn't rationalize hurting it. Okay. Moving on. Common behavioral red flags. Okay. So red flags, those things we look for to see if there's it might tip off that something's going on. Again, living beyond your means, financial difficulties, unusually close association with vendor or customers. There's also the idea that there may be no behavioral red flags. Okay, and there may be control issues or an unwillingness to share duties. That's a good one. It's like, no. I will do the payroll, every 2 weeks. And I'll come back from vacation to do payroll. I can't, nobody, no one else can do payroll as good as I can. Not a good thing. Okay. So now, here comes Dr. Steve Albrecht. And he says, okay, well, he assembled a complete list. I don't know if it's complete, but it's pretty thorough list of pressure, opportunity, and integrity variables So he's got a list of 50 possible indicators of occupational fraud and abuse. The variables fell into two categories: perpetrator characteristics and the organizational environment. And so we go from the fraud triangle to the fraud scale. So it's kind of like, your bathroom scale. Okay. And after you pick up a number of these, then your weight goes over 200 pounds, whatever. Okay, here are the 10 most highly ranked personal characteristic fraud factors. So look, again, we talk about the organization, we talk about the person. Here are the personal characteristics. Living beyond their means, always at the top of the list. Okay. Overwhelming desire for personal gain, high personal debts, close association with customers. They feel their pay is not commensurate with the responsibilities they've been given. They have a wheeler-dealer attitude, okay? Or they want to beat the system. Gambling. A couple of studies have pointed out that when gambling gets legalized in different jurisdictions, the incidence of fraud starts to skyrocket. Now, the gambling industry, which they call themselves the gaming industry, they've disputed that and have their own findings, but you can look into that yourself. Undue family or peer pressure, or no recognition for their job performance. These are the top 10, according to Steve Albrecht. These are, now, again, this is a mislabeled slide. This isn't here's the personal characteristics, and the other is organizational environment. So here are the top 10 organizational environment fraud factors. They place too much trust in key employees. They have one person in charge of everything in the, accounting department. Not smart. Lack of proper procedures for the authorization of transactions. Inadequate disclosure of personal investments and income. No separation of authorization of transactions from the custody of the assets, right? That's kind of a golden rule of separation of duties. The person who does the authorization or recording is separate from the person who has custody of the asset. Lack of independent checks on performance. Inadequate attention to details. No separation of custody of assets from the accounting for those assets. No separation of duties between accounting functions. Lack of clear lines of authority and responsibility. And the department's not frequently reviewed by internal auditors. Okay, there's your top 10 organizational flaws. So here, Steve has his little fraud scale. It's more like the scale that you might see at a doctor's office, where you kind of shift the weights back and forth. Okay, so you've got the situational pressures, and you've got the opportunities to commit, and you've got the personal integrity. Okay, and so as you shift them, as the pressures go up, as the opportunities to commit go up, and as their personal integrity goes down, then you see, the weight falls on the left-hand side, and you have high fraud. On the other hand, if the people, if there are no situational pressures, low opportunities to commit because you've got some great controls in place, and you hired people with personal integrity, then you may not see fraud at all. And because us fraud researchers just love playing with geometry, here comes Wolf and Hermansen in 2004, adding to our mix capability. Okay, we'll talk about arrogance in a moment. So Wolf and Hermansen said, okay, the fraud triangle could be enhanced by considering a fourth element. So now it's no longer a triangle, it's a diamond. All right. So you've got the incentive, that's that pressure. You've got the opportunity. You got the rationalization. They say, aha, the capability. They suggest that many of the large dollar frauds would not have occurred without the perpetrator having the right capability. Okay, I think for large dollar amount frauds, yeah, where they're hacking into computer systems, where they're doing financial statement fraud, what have you. Yeah, you need a certain amount of skill. On the other hand, a small dollar amount fraud, it's, you really don't need any special skills to do. So Wolf and Hermansen, 2004. Okay, we're going to make it from a triangle into a diamond, adding capability. Well, that wasn't enough for good old Jonathan Marks. So in 2010, he said, whoa. We have to add another side to it. So now we've got the fraud pentagon. Okay. He said, look, arrogance or a lack of conscience, an attitude of superiority and entitlement, or greed on the part of the person who believes that corporate policies and procedures, they don't apply to me. Okay. Maybe you have come across such a person. Those don't apply to me, right? And we see this in various situations, right? And call it whichever term, arrogance, lack of conscience, attitude of superiority or entitlement, greed. This show CNBC has American Greed, right? The psychologists out there, we could throw in narcissism and a bunch of other, fancy terms, but I think we got enough there. And Marx, I guess preferred the term arrogance. Okay, and if that's not enough, here comes Hollinger and Clark, and they have their hypothesis regarding employee theft. They found that employees steal primarily as a result of the workplace conditions. And because of that, they think the true cost of employee theft is vastly understated. There's a lot of fraud going on the employers don't know about. Okay. And so they looked into employee deviance, looked at job satisfaction, and with deviance, if they're not satisfied with the job, be careful. They looked at organizational controls. They looked at the employee's perception of those controls. Okay. That, they got these controls, but nobody ever checks them. And they treat everyone here horribly. So let's talk about this. And by the way, sometimes it's not they treat me horribly, but they treat everyone here, usually including themselves. But they're always thinking of the other people as well. Employee deviance. It's conduct detrimental to the organization and to the employee, primarily caused by job dissatisfactions. Two basic categories. Acts by the employees against property and violations of the norms. Okay, that's how they define it. So, employees who are dissatisfied with their jobs are most likely to seek redress through counterproductive or illegal behavior in order to right the perceived inequity. Okay, they're working us too hard, so I won't work at all. Or I'll work, but then I'll rip them off somehow. Jason Denton documented a pattern in U.S. industry called wages in kind, in which employees situated in structurally disadvantaged parts of the organization receive large segments of their wages invisibly. Okay? That, they take a little bit extra home with them or what have you. Okay? It's like, well, they owe it to me anyhow, and I'm just going to, take it one way or the other. So let's talk about organizational controls on that deviance. The researchers were unable to document a strong relationship between control and deviance. They found a lot about job satisfaction and deviance. They believe that employee education as an organizational policy has a deterrent effect. So, have training sessions about fraud. It's not, the perception. It's not you're teaching your employees how to rip you off. Rather, you're letting the employees know, if you will, at least those who would deviate, that we know how it's done. And so don't even try getting away with it, because we know all the things that you would try. Concern of theft must be expressed without creating an atmosphere of distrust. It's not that we distrust all you people. It's that, if there is thievery going on here, it's going to hurt the organization. And if, we're getting by, if we lost a lot of money through thievery or fraud, we'll just have to shut down and everyone's going to have to get laid off. Okay. Formal organizational controls do negatively influence theft prevalence, but those effects must be understood in combination with other factors influencing the phenomenon. So that was their findings. Big one, though, is the perception of control. The stronger the perception that theft would be detected, the less the likelihood the employee would engage in the deviant behavior. Increasing perception of detection may be the best way to deter employee theft. Possibility of sanctions is secondary. So, when you get caught, we're going to punish you, and we'll, turn you over to the authorities or sue you or whatever. Yeah, that's pretty strong. Stronger is that you'll get caught in the first place. Because if you think you're not going to get caught in the first place, who cares about the sanctions? Control in the workplace consists of both formal and informal social controls. Okay. Some other stuff that Hollinger and Clark came up with, other conclusions. Substantially increasing the internal security presence does not seem to be appropriate, given the prevalence of the problem. Okay, don't just start putting security guards everywhere. The same kinds of employees who engage in other workplace deviance are also principally the ones who engage in employee theft. The researchers hypothesized that if efforts are made to reduce employee theft without reducing the underlying causes, of workplace dissatisfaction, it creates a hydraulic effect. Increased management sensitivity to its employees would reduce all forms of workplace deviance. Okay. So again, put in those support programs. Have it be known that if you're having a problem, we're with you. Special attention should be afforded to the young employees because they're the ones statistically most likely to steal. Now, they may not be able to steal a lot, but are most likely. The incidence rate is higher. Oops, I just did the wrong button here. Hang on a second. What did I do there? There we go. Okay. All right. 4 aspects of policy development for management. Clear understanding regarding theft behavior, continuous dissemination of positive information reflective of the company's policies, enforcement of sanctions, and publicizing sanctions. Aha, we caught someone and they've been let go, or they've been whatever, they've been, we're suing them. That's all part about, getting that perception out there. That they will be caught and they will be punished. So, module 4, the psychology of the fraudster. Deeper look. Okay, Dick Riley particularly likes the mice thing, so we'll talk about that. Predators and collusion. So here we have that Walmart legend and his trail of deceit. And you can read more about this. It's funny. I was on the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners Foundation. And one of my board members was also, I think he was in charge of, financial security, anti-fraud stuff, whatever, for Walmart. And then this story broke, along with another story out of Walmart, Mexico. And suddenly he decided it might be best he leave the board of the ACFE Foundation. Not a good look, Anyway, so got to be careful with Walmart. Though it is Walmart is the biggest employer in the state of Illinois. So there you go. Any of you ever worked for Walmart? Raise your hand if you have. Nope. Hey, here's a question. Any of you ever work for McDonald's? Okay. McDonald's and Walmart hire a lot of people. It's almost amazing that no one raised their hands. Maybe they're not. Maybe you're not listening. Are you listening out there? Okay. So here's this thing that Dick Riley likes a lot called MICE. It stands for money, ideology, coercion, and either ego or entitlement, or kind of both. Okay, it's sort of the arrogance and entitlement thing. Ego, entitlement. So money, ideology, coercion, and ego, entitlement. So money and ego are the two most commonly observed motivations. Okay, why did you commit this fraud? Wanted the money. But then there's also that second place, which is, they don't, and you see these in cases you read about where, some wealthy individual nonetheless commits a fraud. They really don't need the money, but their arrogance kind of motivated them. Less frequently are individuals individually unwillingly pulled into the fraud scheme. They've been blackmailed or what have you, coerced. We need you to give us the whatever access to the computer system, and they were coerced into doing it. The least frequent is probably ideology, especially least frequent for white collar crime. But society has seen this occur in the case of terrorist financing. As I say, out in Vienna, Austria, at the UN there, they have a section of the UN on international crime. So one of the things they look at is some of the fraud crimes that are committed. For example, counterfeit luxury goods. Some of that money has been funneled back to terrorist organizations. So you sure you're buying only really good, it's usually very expensive luxury goods. The fraud triangle can be used to understand other financial disputes that are subject of forensic accounting examinations. All right, but MICE, money, okay, ideology, coercion, and ego. All right. And some other studies divide fraudsters into two groups. And this is important. The predatory fraudster and the situational fraudster. Situational fraudster is generally considered to be a law-abiding person. Okay, this is the fraudster who has no criminal record, who under normal circumstances would never have considered fraud. The fraud triangle most closely aligns with the situational fraudster, who, in my humble opinion, is the vast number, the biggest number of fraudsters. On the other hand, the predatory fraudster, or as I like the professional fraudster, seeks out organizations where he or she can start to scheme as soon as they hit the ground. Okay. They're usually the subject of, movies on Netflix, things like that. They're interesting creatures because they're out, and there's a lot of ego, a lot of arrogance there. They know they'll go into an organization and they will figure out quickly how to clean them out and then get away without being caught. Okay. Think of George Clooney in the Ocean 11 movies. Okay. Beyond the predator type person, we also find individuals and organizations that have operational modus operandi. Okay, the method of operation. This is how they conduct business. Where a complex fraud or financial crime is inherently part of their goals and objectives. The important point is that predators and organizations that focus on criminal activities do in fact exist. Again, most frauds conducted by usually a law-abiding person who got into a situation where they're committing the fraud because they've got this non-shareable problem. But then they're the professional fraudsters who make a living out of committing frauds. It's funny, there were certain types of frauds that we see that, especially there were some from a few years ago dealing with cash register terminals, and it started out in the summer up in Canada when the weather was nice. As the weather started getting colder, this fraud and the fraudsters perpetrating it started, moving south. Most went to Florida, wouldn't you know it, and spent the winter down there and then moved back up north. They were like snowbird fraudsters. These are professional fraudsters. This is what they do. This is their MO, their modus operandi. So the predatory fraudsters, oh boy, look at what the heck, double pyramid design we have here. These types of entities are involved in complex frauds, corruption schemes, and financial crimes. They're better organized, have better concealment schemes, and are better prepared to deal with oversight mechanisms. With regard to the fraud triangle and predators, pressure and rationalization play little or no role because they just need the opportunity. As I say, with this Ocean 11, there, at least in the first movie, they had a rationalization. Okay. But a professional fraudster doesn't need to rationalize. That's what they do. Okay. And they don't need a financial pressure. It's just, gonna do their thing. All right. Collusion and collusive groups. So in 2005, the AICPA identified collusion along with management override as the Achilles, I say it should be heels because they got two of them there, the Achilles heels of anti-fraud efforts. Okay. Again, most frauds, we saw the statistic last week, committed by loners. But when you get more than one person involved, because you can then override a lot of those controls that would, be used to detect the fraud and then nip it in the bud, have been, taken care of. They've been overridden. All right. So the ACFE, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, suggests that one possible reason for the increase in losses associated with multiple perpetrators is that many anti-fraud controls work on the basis of separation of duties and independent checks. So you get the independent checker in on it, and suddenly the fraud has nothing to stop it. When multiple fraudsters work together, they're able to undermine the independent verification of transactions or other mechanisms designed to uncover, to detect the fraud. In a collusive environment, co-offenders are likely purposefully selected for their skill set, more likely their access, right? So you and it's one person or two people say, who we need in on this? We need this person. Again, you see this in the movies. Okay, let's see if we can get so and so in on it. And usually they find a reason. Your boss is treating you terribly, isn't he? Yeah. Join us. And then you take the controls away. Good stuff. There's our chart with the impact of collusion. Again, the median loss from that loner fraudster, $85,000. Half of the frauds are below, half are above. Two people, suddenly it jumps up to 150,000. So you see, the percentage of cases, 52, almost 53% of the cases, over half the cases is a loner. Median loss only 85,000. Only 17.4% of the cases you have two people, but now you've almost doubled the median loss. Even fewer, 10.6% of the cases have three people, but the median loss is stepped up to 220,000. Only 5.4% are four people. Now you're almost at 300,000. And then you get five or more, boom, median loss over $500,000, 633,000. Wow. Okay. So leader characteristics differences between the collusive frauds and the solo frauds. Collusive fraudsters tend to be younger, more likely to be male, less likely to have college degrees than the solo offender, less likely to exhibit addiction problems or excessive control issues, more likely to have unusually close association with vendors or customers, and the wheeler-dealer attitude. Okay. So young guy in there, he's gonna, work the system, bring in a few people with him to pull off that big score. Incident characteristics. Okay. This is the solo fraudster. Okay. Again, tends to be older and more likely to be involved in financial statement frauds, which results in bigger dollar amounts because they're higher up in the organization, shorter duration, more likely to be discovered by a tip or complaint, internal audit, law enforcement, accident. Less likely in U.S. organizations than in non-U.S. organizations. Okay. And here's a case from 2005 that kind of shook the forensic accounting and fraud examination community. Okay. So we have this case, well, a couple of cases, all came out, first two in 2005 and then 2017. So we have an appellate court case called a federal appellate court case. No, that might be I forget which court had that. I think it was the state Supreme Court. So you got, hang on, I'll look it up real quick. Yeah, I hate when I don't know something. So let me look that up real quick. Yes, this is Court of Appeals of the State of Utah. Okay. And so they were going to bring in the civil case, and they were going to bring in the testimony of an expert to talk about the fraud triangle. And the judge in that case, said no. And it was allowed in the trial court, went up on appeal, and the appellate court said, nope. You're not going to make the fraud triangle, does not qualify for expert testimony. Then you got Travis versus State Farm, and that was in 2005, and that was a federal district court case. Let me see what state that was in. No. 10th Circuit. Oh, went up to the 10th. No, that's not it. That's their State Farm. Well, according to authors, it's a U.S. District Court case, but in that the judge noted that applying the fraud triangle relies more on professional judgment than on hard science. Said, it's a nice theory, but really admissible in court. Oh, somebody turn the microphone on. I'm going to get a feedback there. And then you got Kremski, okay, another federal district court case for the court denied the request for testimony regarding the fraud triangle. So courts have said you can't just come in and start throwing around the fraud triangle and say, well, here, this person must be the fraudster because all three components of the fraud triangle there. No. The fraud triangle was essentially misused that way. It should be a way of giving you some insight into the fraud itself and conducting your investigation. It really shouldn't, I agree with the courts, it shouldn't be part of the case against the alleged fraudster. So, nonetheless, some folks have been able to get the fraud triangle into court, such as, okay, don't call it a theory. That judges don't like, they don't want to be, the judge who had allowed some theory to come in, okay? You cannot use the elements of the fraud triangle to show someone has a propensity or not to commit fraud. So you can't say, see, he had all of the elements here, all three elements of the fraud triangle, so therefore he was more likely to commit the fraud. No. I've had cases I've been on where people had all three and they were completely honest. Nor can you use it in defense and go, he did not have that financial pressure, so therefore he could not have committed the fraud. Maybe it was just his ego. Also, expert witnesses cannot use the fraud triangle to speculate about the mental state of the person accused of fraud. No, don't do that. Yeah. Again, fraud triangle has its place in helping you conduct the investigation. Don't try bringing it into court. Then, so we've been going through the triangle, to the diamond, to the pentagon, to the two pyramids, blah, 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 blah. But now we have the meta model. Corollary to the fraud triangle is something called the triangle of fraud action, sometimes referred to as the elements of fraud triangle. The triangle of fraud action describes the actions an individual must perform to perpetrate a fraud. So fraud triangle, these are the elements that are usually present for someone to commit a fraud. Fraud action triangle, okay, these are this is what the person has to do. So, and those three components are the act, okay, the execution and methodology of the fraud. The concealment, remember, fraud is a surreptitious crime, okay, keep it concealed, representing the disguising or hiding the fraud. And then the conversion, the process of turning the ill-gotten gains into something of value to the perpetrator. So the triangle of fraud action represents specific actions that can be documented in form of evidence. More likely you'll get that triangle used in court. So here on the left, you got the classic fraud triangle, okay, where the perpetrator has opportunity, rationalization, and financial pressure. Then on the right, the triangle fraud action. The act itself, the concealment, and the conversion. Okay. In the middle, you've got the anti-fraud measures. Okay. So you have, they have the function of the absence of anti-fraud measures, and so you get the anti-fraud mechanisms is what we put in the middle to try and prevent that perpetrator who wants to commit the fraud from actually doing it. So we put in detection measures, okay, that take away the concealment side of the triangle of fraud action. Okay, prevention, deterrence, and perception detection. So that is, the biggie. So the conversion, we have investigation, consequence, remediation. But detection measures, in my mind, is key. All right, that's the meta model. And then we're at the end of the chapter, and there's your copyright